All right, here goes. This is a tough post to write, but I feel like I need to get this out there, maybe to make sense of it myself. I don't know if I'm looking for advice or just trying to wrap my head around everything that's happened. I'm John, and I thought I had the perfect life. 5 years married to Rachel, who I honestly believed was the love of my life. We met in college, both driven, both with big dreams, and from the start, we were inseparable. She was the type of woman who could light up a room, and I was head over heels for her from the very beginning. We talked a lot about the future, about building a life together. Both of us wanted a family more than anything. We talk about names, dream about what kind of parents we'd be, the little traditions we'd start. It felt so good to have someone who wanted the same things I did, who was just as excited about building a life as I was. Then, when we finally found out Rachel was pregnant, it felt like all those dreams were coming true. I'd never seen her happier. And honestly, I'd never been happier either. I could picture us holding our son, raising him together, growing as a family. For me, this was it. Our family was all I wanted in the world. When Ethan was born, that feeling was solidified. Holding him for the first time, seeing Rachel holding him, I thought, this is it. This is everything I've ever wanted. Rachel looked at me with this proud, loving expression, and I felt like we were more connected than ever. That's how things started. I thought I'd found my happily ever after. The first few months with Ethan were exactly what I'd hoped for, even with the exhaustion. Rachel and I were a team, taking turns on the night shifts, figuring out the rhythm of being parents together. I could see how much she loved Ethan, how natural she was with him, and it made me fall in love with her even more. We were both tired but happy. But then, things started to change. It was small stuff at first. Rachel seemed distant, almost like she wasn't fully there even when we were all together. I figured it was exhaustion, or maybe even postpartum depression. I'd heard that a lot of moms go through that, and I wanted to support her however I could. I encouraged her to take time for herself, told her I could handle Ethan for a while so she could get out and recharge. I wanted her to feel like herself again. So she did. She started going out more, sometimes in the afternoons, and later on even in the evenings. At first, I thought it was a good thing. She'd come back a little more relaxed, less on edge. I didn't want to push or ask too many questions, thinking she just needed her own space to adjust. But as the weeks passed, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. It wasn't just that she was going out. It was that, even when she was home, it felt like she was somewhere else. And every time I tried to talk to her about it, she'd brush me off or say she was just tired, just stressed, and that I shouldn't worry so much. So I didn't push. Weeks turned into months, and the distance between us just seemed to grow. Rachel would head out once Ethan was asleep, sometimes saying she needed to clear her head or that she was meeting up with friends. I wanted to trust her. Hell, I did trust her. She was my wife, and we'd just had a child together. But something about the whole thing felt off, and it started eating away at me. She got weird about her phone too. I noticed her hiding it whenever I walked into the room, and she started taking it everywhere, even just to grab a glass of water. It was like she was glued to it, constantly texting or checking something, but whenever I'd ask what she was up to, she'd shrug and give me a vague answer or laugh it off. Once, I reached for her phone just to check the time, and she snatched it out of my hand so quickly it made me feel like I'd done something wrong. I kept telling myself that this was all in my head, that maybe I was being paranoid. I figured the lack of sleep, the stress of having a newborn, and watching Rachel struggle had probably made me more sensitive. Besides, I knew she'd been dealing with a lot adjusting to motherhood, handling all those sleepless nights. I kept convincing myself that her pulling away was just temporary, something we'd eventually work through. But deep down, a small part of me was starting to question things. Then came the day I can't get out of my head. Rachel had gone out for one of her me-time evenings, and for the first time, she left her phone sitting on the kitchen counter. I tried to ignore it, tried to convince myself that I didn't need to look, but something in me snapped. I couldn't take the feeling of being left in the dark anymore. So, with my heart pounding in my chest, I picked it up. The second I opened her messages, my stomach dropped. Right there, clear as day, were texts from someone named Jake. And these weren't just friendly messages. They were intimate, flirtatious, and some of them graphic. There were entire conversations about where they'd meet, what they'd do. I felt sick. I read texts of her telling him how much she looked forward to seeing him, how he made her feel alive. It was like my worst nightmare was right there in front of me. I kept scrolling, desperately hoping I was somehow misunderstanding, that maybe this was all some twisted joke. But the more I read, the clearer it became. Rachel was having an affair. She had been lying to me for months, slipping out after our son was asleep, leaving me at home with Ethan while she went off to be with someone else. I put her phone down, feeling numb, hollow. This was the woman I'd given everything to, the mother of my child, the one person I thought I could trust more than anyone. And in one evening, everything we'd built was shattered. After that night, I didn't sleep. I just sat there in the dark, my mind racing between shock, anger, and this gut-wrenching sadness. I kept looking over at Ethan's crib, thinking about the family we'd dreamed of, the life we'd built. I didn't want to lose it. I didn't want to lose her. As betrayed as I felt, part of me still hoped we could fix this, for our son's sake, for the years we'd shared. The next morning, when Rachel got home, I told her we needed to talk. She looked at me with this blank expression, like she had no idea what I discovered, no clue about the world she'd just torn apart. I asked her straight up about Jake. For a second, she looked panicked, then defensive. She tried to deny it, said he was just a friend, but her face told me everything I needed to know. I told her I'd read the messages that I knew, and she just stared at me like she was calculating her next move. Eventually, she admitted it, said it was just a fling, and that it didn't mean anything. Her tone was almost cold, like she was annoyed I'd even brought it up. I tried to stay calm, told her we could work through this, that maybe we should try counseling, that I was willing to do whatever it took. But instead of relief or remorse, she just sighed and said she didn't know if she wanted that. She kept talking about how she needed freedom, how motherhood had made her feel trapped, and how Jake gave her something she felt she was missing. It was like she'd already made up her mind that whatever we'd had was no longer enough for her. After that conversation, things just went downhill. Every attempt I made to talk about our family, to try and fix things, only seemed to push Rachel further away. Every time I brought up counseling or even suggested spending more time together, she'd roll her eyes or give me some cold, dismissive response. She started staying out later, coming back only after I'd already put Ethan to bed. Our home, which had once been full of laughter and warmth, felt like a stranger's house. When we did talk, it always turned into an argument. Rachel would accuse me of trying to control her, saying she needed to live her own life. She acted like I was the one who'd done something wrong, like I was holding her back. And she'd throw the word freedom in my face every time. Freedom from what? From our marriage? From our family? One night, I couldn't hold back anymore. I told her that if she needed freedom so badly, maybe she should just leave. I thought it might shake her, make her realize what she was doing to us. But instead, she just laughed. She actually laughed and told me not to act dramatic. I felt like I was losing my mind, like I was the only one fighting for a family that didn't even seem to matter to her anymore. And as much as it hurt to admit, I was starting to realize that maybe she wasn't going to come back. After weeks of trying, of pushing and pleading, I was exhausted. Every night felt like an uphill battle, and no matter what I did, it was clear that Rachel wasn't interested in rebuilding what we once had. She had checked out, emotionally and mentally, and every argument, every cold look, chipped away at the hope I'd been desperately clinging to. One night, as I was sitting alone in the living room, I realized I couldn't keep doing this to myself, or to Ethan. He deserved stability, a home filled with love and care, not the tension that filled our walls. And as much as it tore me apart, I knew I couldn't keep fighting for a marriage if I was the only one still holding on. It hurt to let go, to even think about a future without Rachel as my partner. But I knew I had to accept the truth. She wasn't coming back. Not to me, not to our family. So I decided it was time to focus on what mattered, being there for my son. I didn't want him to grow up in a home where his parents resented each other. I didn't want him to feel the weight of a broken marriage. For his sake and for my own sanity, I had to let Rachel go. After coming to terms with my decision, I approached Rachel about officially separating. I told her that if she wanted her freedom, she could have it, but that we needed to be civil for Ethan's sake. At first, she acted surprised, like she hadn't expected me to finally stand up and end things. But after a moment, she just shrugged, almost like she was relieved. We sat down to talk about logistics, who would keep the house, how we'd manage custody with Ethan, how we'd break the news to our families. But even in that moment, she was detached, almost businesslike, like we were discussing a contract, not the end of our life together. She barely mentioned Ethan, almost as if he was just an afterthought in this whole process. I felt a pang of anger, realizing how little this seemed to mean to her. In the end, we agreed that I would keep the house. She wanted to start fresh somewhere else, and frankly, I didn't want to uproot Ethan from the only home he'd known. It was a painful discussion, but a necessary one. By the time she left, I felt drained, hollow, but strangely, there was also a sense of relief. This was the beginning of something new, something I hadn't planned, but would somehow have to make work, for me and most importantly for my son. Telling family and friends was, in some ways, even harder than coming to terms with the separation itself. We'd been that couple. Everyone thought we were solid, the kind of family you could count on. Breaking the news felt like admitting failure, like I hadn't just lost my wife, but also the future we'd painted for everyone else. When I told my parents, my mom cried, her hand covering her mouth in shock. She kept asking if there was anything we could do, if maybe we were just going through a rough patch. But when I told her about the affair, about Rachel's complete disregard for the family, the tears turned to anger. My dad stayed quiet, but I could see the disappointment in his eyes. Not in me, but in the situation we all now had to face. They offered support, told me they'd be there to help with Ethan, and I felt a weight lift knowing I wasn't alone. Rachel, on the other hand, seemed unfazed about telling her family. I found out later she'd framed it as us growing apart, like it was just some mutual decision, something casual. It hurt to know she couldn't even be honest about the damage she'd done. But as painful as it was, I knew I had to move forward to find strength in the people who genuinely cared about me and Ethan. We were going to need every ounce of support to get through this. With the separation finalized, the next challenge was figuring out how to co-parent with Rachel. She'd moved into a new apartment across town, and we agreed on a shared custody arrangement for Ethan, though I kept primary custody. It felt surreal, handing Ethan over to her for visits, watching him wave goodbye to me from the back seat of her car. This wasn't the family life I'd pictured. Rachel's attitude toward co-parenting was casual, to say the least. She would often ask to switch days last minute or cancel altogether, leaving me scrambling to adjust my work schedule or cancel plans. When I'd bring it up, she'd get defensive, accusing me of being too controlling or inflexible. It felt like another excuse for her to brush off the responsibility, to show me that motherhood was still just a part-time job to her. Ethan, thankfully, was too young to understand, but it didn't make it any easier on me. I started feeling like I was doing this alone, that I couldn't rely on her even when it came to our son. I was determined to be there for him, to be the stability he needed, but there were nights I'd put him to bed and just sit in the quiet, feeling this heavy sadness creep in. This was my reality now, and as much as I tried to accept it, part of me kept wishing it was all just some terrible dream. With each passing week, I found myself leaning into a routine, one built around Ethan. I'd get him up each morning, make breakfast, and we'd go through our day, playing, reading, just being together. The more I focused on him, the less time I had to dwell on the heartbreak or the disappointment. He became my anchor, my reason to push forward when everything else felt like it was crumbling. I started finding a strange kind of peace in the little things. Watching him take his first steps, hearing his laughter, the feel of his small hand in mine as we walked through the park. I realized that, despite everything Rachel had done, she couldn't take this away from me. I was still Ethan's dad, and I was determined to give him a life full of love, regardless of how broken our family felt. My friends and family began stepping in too, offering help and encouragement. They'd babysit so I could have an evening off or come over to keep me company. Slowly, I started feeling like I wasn't carrying the weight alone. It was a reminder that while my marriage might have ended, I still had people who cared, people who wanted to see Ethan and me thrive. In those moments, I started to see a future, one I hadn't planned for, but was beginning to embrace. Over time, Rachel's involvement with Ethan started fading more and more. She'd skip scheduled visits, or she'd call last minute with some excuse about being too busy or needing to catch up on things. At first, I tried to be understanding, thinking maybe she was struggling with her new reality too. But as the weeks wore on, it became clear that her priorities were elsewhere. Ethan would ask about her, as much as a toddler could, looking for her on the days she was supposed to come around. I'd distract him, take him to the park, or find some game to play, anything to keep him from noticing her absence. But I couldn't stop the ache in my chest when I saw the confusion in his eyes, the questions he didn't have the words to ask yet. One evening, after she canceled at the last minute again, I texted her, asking if she could at least be more consistent for Ethan's sake. Her response was short, almost dismissive, saying I was being too rigid and needed to give her some space. Space? After everything she'd done, all the ways she'd hurt us, and now she wanted space? I sat there, staring at the message, feeling a mix of anger and helplessness. This was the woman I'd once trusted with my life, and now she couldn't even be bothered to show up for her own son. That was the moment I knew I couldn't rely on her, not as a partner, not even as a co-parent. I had to be enough for Ethan because she was making it clear that she wasn't going to be. It hurt deeply, but I decided right then that I would pour every ounce of love, patience, and stability into his life to make up for what he was losing. After Rachel's repeated absence and her dismissive attitude, the resentment started building up inside me like a weight I couldn't shake. Every time she canceled or ignored her responsibilities, it fueled this bitterness I hadn't known I was capable of. I didn't want to feel that way. I didn't want to hold on to this anger, especially knowing it would affect Ethan someday if I let it consume me. One night, after putting Ethan to bed, I sat down alone and thought long and hard about what I was holding on to. I had to ask myself what I was trying to save, who I was trying to protect. I realized that part of me was still clinging to an idea of Rachel that no longer existed. The woman I loved, the one I'd built all those dreams with, she wasn't here anymore. And maybe she never truly was. I had to stop seeing her as the person she used to be and start seeing her for who she'd become. It was one of the hardest mental shifts I'd ever made, but as I began letting go of that resentment, I felt a kind of relief. It was freeing to stop expecting something from her that she couldn't give, to stop being disappointed every time she failed to show up. I decided that I'd be the best father I could be, not because I wanted to prove her wrong or make her feel guilty, but because that's what Ethan deserved. Letting go of the anger was my way of moving forward, of building a life that was no longer about the past. With the anger finally starting to fade, I found myself settling into single fatherhood in ways I hadn't expected. The sadness would still creep in from time to time, but it was getting easier to push it aside, to focus on the little moments with Ethan that made it all worth it. We built our own routines, our own traditions, Sunday pancakes, bedtime stories, walks to the park. It was just us, and honestly, it felt right. I started noticing how much Ethan looked to me, how he mirrored my reactions, my words. He was watching me, learning from me, and that realization hit hard. I knew that how I handled this, how I moved forward, would shape the person he'd grow up to be. I wanted him to see strength, resilience, and above all, kindness. I wanted him to know that, no matter what, he had someone who would always be there for him, who wouldn't let him down. Family and friends continued to rally around us, and I began to accept their support more openly, something I hadn't been great at before. They'd invite us over for dinner or offer to babysit, and it reminded me that Ethan and I weren't alone. There was a whole world of people who cared about us, who wanted to see us thrive. Being a single dad wasn't the life I'd planned, but as the days passed, it started feeling like the life I was meant to have. I had a purpose again, one that went beyond the broken dreams with Rachel. My purpose was Ethan, giving him a life filled with love and security. Months went by, and life started to feel normal again. Not the normal I'd once envisioned, but a new kind of steady, a new foundation for Ethan and me. I realized that Rachel's absence, as painful as it had been, had also opened up space for us to build something fresh, something untainted by lies and betrayal. Our home became a place of peace, a place filled with laughter and love, just as I'd always wanted it to be. I focused on work, on being the best father I could, and on healing. Slowly, that aching void left by Rachel's betrayal started filling with gratitude for the life I was building. I stopped thinking of myself as someone who'd been abandoned, and instead, I saw myself as someone who had chosen to rise above it, to grow stronger for his son. My family, my friends, and even strangers, people I met at the park or playgroups with Ethan, became part of our new life, offering support and kindness I hadn't expected. Now, when I look at Ethan, I don't see the broken family I used to fear he'd grow up in. I see love, resilience, and the possibility of a good, happy life. We're doing okay, and even though this journey wasn't what I'd planned, I know that as long as I have him, I have everything I need. This isn't the end of our story. It's the beginning of a new chapter, one built on strength, trust, and a love that won't falter.